This edition of the Science Review is rather special. It comes to you from Arizona. We're at a conference, the Origins Initiative, put on by Arizona State University. Largely responsible for that is on my left, Lawrence Krauss. We'll get into that later. You've been watching possibly some of it on the web, and we'll be carrying it on the Science Network later. So this is a discussion among some of the people who've been here. On my far left is Richard Dawkins. Next to him, A.C. Grayling, Lawrence Krauss, as I said. On my right, Stephen Pinker and Brian Greene. We're going to go through a few issues that deal basically with science and society, science and social policy. And I was going to suggest as a beginning that next year is the 350th anniversary of the Royal Society. It's a major event, an enterprise that's been going on now essentially at the beginning of what would loosely be called the scientific revolution. And it's a manifestation to some extent of Francis Bacon's ideas. Bacon wrote this extraordinary utopian book called The New Atlantis, which, despite its flaws, had some wonderful ideas in it, one of which was that there were merchants of light on this island because their primary commodity that they were exchanging and seeking out was the light of understanding. So at some point next year, we'll be doing a meeting called, in the Beyond Belief series, Beyond Belief, the Merchants of Light, and it will be in the form of essentially a shareholders report about the state of this enterprise of science over this period. So I want to start by asking you, how are we doing? What are the upsides and the downsides from your own disciplines? What's your sense of science at this particular time when we have a president in the United States who says he wants to restore science to its rightful place on the US agenda, and the leader of the House here who also says that her agenda is 4 words: science, 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 and science. So this is a great opportunity for scientists to speak out about what they're thinking at this point. So who'd like to go first?
I will. It's a great opportunity. It's a great challenge. I mean, one of the reasons that it's become so important is we are recovering from a time when science was having extreme difficulties in terms of being the sound basis of public policy. 8 years in this country where it was really being ignored or censored or distorted. At the same time, and this is perhaps more relevant to the group that we have here, there are great challenges, again, in this country, but in other places in the world, challenges to the notion of scientific rationality. And I think more than any time in perhaps the last century, we are at this threshold of conflict and it's hard to know where it's going to go worldwide. So I think the scientific endeavor is doing fine. We have, as a discipline, suffered in this country and elsewhere because science was not being the basis of sound public policy, which it should be. It should inform public policy. No one wants scientists to be decision makers so much as to be able to have the results of empirical study be used by those who are empowered by the public to make decisions on their behalf. And we've suffered severely, and so that's what makes this so exciting. And it's a time of hope, but I think a great challenge because we've suffered tremendously because of a lack of sound policy in the past.
Yeah. Now, it's no surprise, is it, before we get another response, it's no surprise, I should obviously make the point that you guys obviously all believe in this to the extent that you are public faces of science. You're public intellectuals, you're communicators. Richard, particularly on selfish gene evolution stories, but also on the God Delusion book and so on. Anthony Grayling, philosophy, communication of ideas about what is good, what is right, moral issues, and so on. Steve, last book, The Stuff of Thought, so very much interested in how we think. And Brian, the cosmos, the big stage. Your role in this is obviously important. So let's start at this end and pick up from where Lawrence started there and see what your sense is from your place on that. Unless Richard,
well,
do you want to?
I was just going to say, I thought we were talking about the last 350 years, not current policy in the United States.
Oh no, but you're absolutely the last 350 years. Okay. Do you want to actually go in now?
Well, I thought we decided on 2 different things. One was the last 350 years and then current policy. It sounds as though Lawrence jumped into part two rather than...
I thought he asked at the current time, but maybe you want to start,
Well,
you want to start this all over
no,
again?
no. You're all such nimble thinkers that we'll go between one and the other. I actually would make the case, I think I could at least try and make the case that there's something not dissimilar now to then. I mean, the 1660 was a time of great turmoil. There was just a beginnings in science. Hooke, Wren, Boyle, and so on were just beginning to meet. There were no coffee houses, if you will recall, in England until 1650. Coffee houses in London in 1652, and if you read Pepys and John Evelyn, you find that all these mechanics and the virtuosi, like Wren, Hooke, Boyle, and so on, are meeting at these new places, and there's a kind of a coffee internet. There's a cognitively enhanced driving engine going on, bringing all these people together into a community, the kind of community of science that Bacon was advocating. I would suggest that after a lot of the disarray socially that's been going on recently, that the sort of sense of science now is not radically dissimilar. It's a great opportunity to do the same sort of thing.
Well,
so
Roger,
that's the link I wanted to make.
It's quite a good point, because we just come out of war, are in a period of turmoil. There's conflict in the world of a serious kind, which the US is deeply engaged in, and we've got this economic difficulty that we find now. Just come out of a double presidency, and two terms president who's been very inimical to science, and Lawrence is right about that. And there are some parallels with 1660. The Civil War period, the Commonwealth period, the restoration of the monarchy, and so on. So there are these superficial analogies at the very least. But one thing one has to remember is that the foundation of the Royal Society was not just the origin of something, the beginning of something very important in the institutionalization of science as an important thing in society, but it was the end product of something, of 100 years of struggle between, on the one hand, the emerging empirical studies, and on the other, reactionary forces, in particular the church, that was made very anxious by some of the things that the new sciences were saying. And the fact that an institution could be set up in 1660 was the mark of a success. That there'd been a victory of an intellectual kind at the end of that century, that had started with Copernicus and all the great changes there. So it's an important point to remember that it's a mark of a stage in a process which has been a longer and a richer one.
I was focusing on the notion of how do you build a community which is engaged with, sympathetic to, supportive of, and doing good science.
Well, I mean, obviously, there's one huge difference between now and then. The science has become such a community. That's what I think the people at this table try to do, is explain to the public how the scientific community works so successfully internationally together to change the world, and that's happened and will continue to happen regardless of the public perception of it.
Yeah, but let's Brian had a point.
Well, it's interesting. You began by asking, how have we done? And we've done really well. And you think back to Newton, he was trying to figure out the motion of everyday objects, from throwing a ball to the motion of the moon, and he did a really good job. And he did such a good job that it took us a long time before we were able to make the next dramatic steps. But we have. We've been able to understand how molecules work, how atoms work, subatomic particles. We've been able to go the other direction, figure out how neutron stars and black holes, entire galaxies, and the whole universe. We really have a fairly good understanding over a huge range of physical scales. That is a tremendous achievement, but it also sets up a challenge. We are now investigating realms that are so far from everyday experience that it really requires us to be a bridge from very unfamiliar territory, molecules, atoms, and particles, and the strange features of the quantum world and black holes and so on. We need to be the bridge so that the general public recognizes how important these studies are and how exciting it is, the wonder of science, the inspiration that you can get from the ability of this thing inside our heads to go so far beyond and really grasp the universe in a very deep way. So it's been a great time, 350 years, but the success also sets up a great challenge.
I strongly agree with that. I think that the scientific enterprise during the last 350 years is, without a doubt, the crowning achievement of the human species. It's just beyond parallel. It's been progressive, standing on the shoulders of giants. In my own field of biology, since Darwin, We now understand why we're here. We understand what life is all about. We understand what it's for. We don't understand in every detail how it works, but we know what it's here for. And post-Darwin, we no longer have to resort to superstition when faced with the complexity of life, the elegance of life, the strong illusion of design of life, which after all is a hugely persuasive delusion. Then after Darwin, staying within biology, molecular genetics, the achievement from 1953 onwards, has been a quite astounding achievement. The reduction of genetics to a branch of information technology. It's become a branch of computer science. The idea that every living creature carries within it a digital archive, a database of the way its ancestors lived. I mean, Darwin would have killed for such information. It would have been absolutely amazing to Darwin. What a tragedy that he's not here to share in it. I think that it is something we should be enormously proud of as a species. But I agree with Brian that it's also an enormous challenge for the future as well.
Yeah, Steve?
And of course, the culminating step in this progression is that we're turning the tools of science upon ourselves, understanding how the human brain works, how human societies and culture emerge from interactions among the intelligent organisms such as us. And I like to think that it's that final step of turning the microscope around and looking at us as humans that explains what's so special about science and why it's such a fragile, vulnerable enterprise. Namely, that there's much in the operation of the human brain that runs counter to the ideals of science and enlightenment more generally. Some of them are our cognitive limitations that Brian alluded to. It's very hard to wrap your mind around a black hole or relativity or some of the findings from quantum physics. Some of them are because there are attitudes of mind that are hard to shake ourselves out of when it comes to familiar phenomena. It's hard to look at other people and not imagine that they're animated by a soul. It's hard to look at complex life and imagine that it could have arisen without a designer. But I think some of the impediments come more from our social emotions than our cognitive limitations. Namely, the idea that you should believe in something because it's true does not come naturally to people. In most times and places, the assertion of beliefs has been a sign of solidarity with one's culture. You say you believe things to show that you're a loyal member of a coalition. It's a matter of exerting authority. It's a matter of politeness and convention, and the kind of social norms that function within science, within democracies, within well-run intellectual forums like universities that say you must have a reason for your beliefs. You may be called upon to provide them. You may legitimately be challenged without it being a form of disloyalty or insult. That a graduate student can challenge a Nobel Prize winner if she sees a flaw in his argument and it's not a sign of disrespect to him as a person or to the community. That all discourse and all belief are subordinated to what's true is a very unnatural social norm. And that, I think, is what science, but more generally, I think of as enlightenment, secular humanism, well-functioning democracy. Those are the values that animate all of those enterprises, of which science is a particularly successful part.
Now, but I'm not sure that that's true. But except, I think for the public, how we know it's true or not is a very different thing. Whether their willingness to accept that science can distinguish certainly, or at least what's false, which is more important. I think that's just not generally accepted. I obviously agree with Brian and Richard that the last 350 years have been remarkable. But at the same time, if you look at people on the street, if you ask people why a book will fall faster than a piece of paper, most people will say the book is heavier, in spite of the fact that we've known for hundreds of years that that's not the case. If you ask most Americans, at least, whether they quote-unquote believe in evolution, most of them will say they haven't. So there is this disconnect between this remarkable enterprise that has literally changed the world and people's perceptions of it. So I think the biggest challenge for us is not just to convince them of the remarkable developments. I mean, for most people, I think when they think of science, they think of technology, that science has produced better things that make their lives better. But the ideas and process is something we've done a very poor job, I think, of explaining to people about. And I think I think that's the big disconnect, that people need to understand how we make progress in science. And that's a real challenge.
Well, one thing that comes immediately out of what you've just been saying is that science education, especially for the young, the grade school level, has got to be thought about really carefully, because it's a very familiar thing that a lot of kids get put off science, find it too difficult, they find the maths too difficult. There've got to be ways of presenting this material to people that really attract them and bring them in and get more people involved. It's not just a matter of producing more scientists, it's a matter of producing greater scientific literacy. Because the crucial thing at the moment is, you say that people are aware of the fact that technology brings benefits. It also brings serious disbenefits in the form of weapons and accidents that might happen and so on. And that makes people nervous. That's one of the reasons why some people can be hostile to science too. And hostility is always a function of ignorance, largely. I mean, well-informed hostility is something to worry about, but generally speaking, it's ignorance. And so this business about improving scientific literacy in the community is absolutely key. And we know this. There are a heck of a lot of people out there who don't know anything about science. And we've got two problems. One is the people who don't know that they don't know anything and who need to be educated. And worse still, the people who don't know anything, they know they don't know anything and they don't care. And so that's another problem too. In one or another way, and there are lots of enterprises now. Richard has been Professor of Public Understanding of Science. Brian runs this brilliant thing in New York every summer which educates people, finds ways of getting the message across there in unconventional, exciting, entertaining sort of ways. That is where the focus has to be now. It's absolutely crucial to our time with this increasingly rapid explosion of insight, of mastery of aspects of nature, that more and more people should be good participants in the conversation about what science is, what it's for, what effects it can have on us, and that comes down to this project of a lifelong process of educating people to be more literate and to understand something of what's going on.
Yeah, I have to say, I can't say I agree with you. I mean, I agree with absolutely everything you say there, because I've encountered so many kids who, when I begin to tell them some of the interesting things, or the things that I think are interesting about science, things about cosmology or astrophysics or particle theory, to see their eyes widen and have them say, that's science? Because that's not what they've experienced science to be. Because so often in the classroom, we quickly focus in on the details, trying to get kids to solve equations and balance reactions and so forth. And the reason for that is clear. The details are important. They're also very easy to examine, right? So you can have tests that are really based on the details, getting the right answer. And if we don't have a commensurate focus on the big, wonderful ideas of science that get kids excited about it, they just don't care enough about the details to really want to engage with them.
Yeah, you all know Natalie Angier's wonderful book, The Canon, in which she has an interview with Peter Gallison, the historian of science at Harvard. And Peter says there's this incredibly difficult task. You take these bright, energetic, information-sucking objects
And beat
called
science
children,
out of them or something, right?
And you manage to push this rock to the top of the hill there of making them completely disinterested.
Right.
And Natalie says that then what happens is that about the age of 12, people can go and buy their kids a membership card to the Museum of Contemporary Art, and they leave the science behind, which is why the World Science Festival and all the things that you guys are involved in sound like but it's not just the kids, is it? There has to be this entire spectrum being.
And I'm going to throw in one of the reasons, I'm going to throw in a plug for why we're here. One of the reasons we've picked Origins to focus on is specifically because we've found that Origins is an area which both excites interest and controversy. And gets you want to motivate people to get over the threshold to at least listen. And you want to bring together enough people that get people excited. And I have to say that one of the most exciting events that's happened in this meeting was when we were in an inner city school in Phoenix. We had 1,000 high school kids for 2 hours, and it was like a basketball event with 3 of the Nobel laureates here. And the kids, I wouldn't have believed it. They didn't have to be there. They literally were not being forced to be there, and they were thrilled to be there. And so there is that inner interest and excitement, and we just have to think of ways to motivate not only just the kids, but the people who teach the kids and the people who also write about science and the people who also show it on TV, that actually people are fascinated by this if you give them a chance.
Yeah.
I think there are two problems with educating people about science. One is that there's the presumption that you should sell science on being useful. Now, science is useful, but the important thing is it's not all it is. And usefulness is not the most exciting thing. A lot of people think it is. They sell the space program on the fact that non-stick frying pans are a spin-off. I mean, that is so demeaning to something as noble as the space program. An analogy which I like is that you can appreciate music without actually being able to play an instrument. And a lot of people have a love of music drummed out of them by five-finger exercises on the piano, when they could be listening to Mozart. And the equivalent to listening to Mozart is your thing about having the Nobel Prize winners coming and telling about the wonders of the universe. And similarly, in school, you don't have to teach science by getting out a Bunsen burner and getting people to melt things in crucibles and things. You can teach how wonderful it is, how elegant it is.
That's because we want to also, as educators, we tend to want to create clones of ourselves, I think. And Brian brought up, well, we tend to think it's really important that these students have all the skills that we have, but most of them don't need them. They're not going to be physicists or biologists. What they need is an understanding of the process and the wonder. And I think we were getting...
I agree with everything, except that I think we'd be deluding ourselves to think that the only reason that there's hostility to science is because there's ignorance of science. And in fact, there are studies of people who endorse evolution because they come from blue states and they like Barack Obama and they know that endorsing evolution is the correct thing to do, who actually have a rather faulty understanding of it. And I would not be surprised if the converse was true, that some of the people who are hostile to evolution probably understand at least the core of what makes it work. People also attach moral and cultural significance to certain beliefs. And the people who are hostile to evolution are ones who think that it is incompatible with moral values, that if evolution were completely true, we would be like, if you teach kids they're animals, they'll behave like animals, we'd be raping, we'd be carrying out the dictates of our selfish genes, value, purpose, meaning would evaporate. So part of the story of science and what makes it so ennobling is that couldn't be farther from the truth, that there is nothing belittling, there's nothing about science that takes away meaning and purpose and morality, and that we have been, I think, doing a poor job in letting the traditional religious and cultural right have the franchise on meaning and morality. There has to be a way of saying that the values that make science possible, such as self-examination, such as a respect for the truth, such as humility and awe and wonder in the face of the natural world, are all ennobling. And moreover, they lead to a sounder morality and ethics than ones based on dogma or cultural inertia.
Yes, I think it's a very, very important point, and I agree very much with Stephen there. A lot of people think that science is reductive in the sense that you don't see the pearl, you only see the disease of the oyster, and somehow this takes all the colour out of the world and all the meaning. And what you can easily do is to tell people that what the 18th century Enlightenment was about the attempt to apply canons of rationality and evidence-based reasoning and empirical constraints to the social sciences and the humanities and the business of government and thinking about the human good. I mean, it's a fascinating thing about that period in time that people saw that there was a way of approaching things and thinking about things, discussing them, which would open up a new understanding, a new depth of understanding across the whole board. So it wasn't just a matter of the natural sciences or natural philosophy as it was called then, but it was about that whole project. And just to go back to something that Lawrence said right at the very beginning about the scientific community, because it's connected to this idea of the ideal, or not the ideal, but the maximally meliorized sort of social setting, is that the astonishing thing about the scientific community is its internationalism, is the fact that it is a pure meritocracy, or almost a pure meritocracy. The fact that there is a set of languages spoken by physicists, by biologists, whatever it might be, which enables them to communicate and share ideas, to challenge one another, to test one another. There's a very healthy kind of competition, sometimes a little unhealthy, and people nick other people's ideas and so on, but generally speaking, it's a very flourishing, a very vigorous community. And if only you could generalize that to other sorts of communities, and perhaps to society at large, it would be great, wouldn't it?
For example, honesty is an absolutely cardinal value of science. The whole scientific enterprise would totally collapse if we couldn't trust each other not to fiddle our figures, whereas the legal profession, for example, is essentially founded on the need to persuade, not exactly against the facts, but at least trying to make the best case you can regardless of the facts.
Well,
Science
but
doesn't work.
You're not saying that scientists are inherently more honest.
I'm not saying that.
No.
I'm not saying that.
Science is. not
Science
scientists.
forces them to be whether
That's
they are
right.
or not.
That's right. Whatever their
just wanted
personal
to make it clear.
inclinations, the whole scientific enterprise depends upon honesty in a way that the legal enterprise absolutely doesn't.
But
But
it
it's-
also suffer. Oh, sorry, Brian.
I was going to say, but it also has a self-correcting mechanism to
Yes.
enforce that.
Peer review and repetition of
replicable
experiments
results,
and so on.
exactly.
But it is incredibly susceptible, and that seems to be because we trust each other. When someone does make a fraud, there's been a lot of examples of how far it can go because we presume honesty.
We're
But it also
such
makes
suckers.
it, but it also
It's
makes it
found out,
difficult.
though.
But it makes it also difficult to counter. I know, for example, in the context of the debate against intelligent design, which I've been a big part of. There are, in fact, the Discovery Institute, which is the major proponent of intelligent design, they know very well that the end justifies the means, and they're willing to distort the truth for that. And many, many scientists have a difficult time responding to that because it is very difficult for scientists to respond to people who are knowingly willing to lie in order to achieve a political end. It's very difficult.
Well, but look, let's talk about this notion of truth, because that sounds like there's some final thing to be found. I mean, most scientists would subscribe to some extent to the philosopher Karl Popper's view of things, where you are constantly coming up with ideas and then you try and falsify them. And so he would do piecemeal social engineering and so on and so forth. I think there is an idea, the general public does have an idea that there is some final truth to be reached, and are somehow find the enterprise wanting when they read in one newspaper that there's a new study out which conflicts completely with the study that came out 3 months ago, which caused them to change their entire medication and so on and so forth. So there's this conflict here between ideal. How do you explain that to people when you're out there?
There's a large part. I think part of it is the need to sell. All of us have experienced this.
Sell?
To sell, yeah, to sell things. I mean, to sell papers, to sell other things, so that many times a new result is jumped on. First of all, by the universities who promote it with press releases, when it may not yet be ready to be reported on. The journalists who then utilize it, and the fact that there is, and the need to always think that in order to sell it. Brian and I are probably more familiar with this. In physics, every new person has to be the next Einstein, and it's if they're not, it's supposed to be interesting to the public. And so we tend to, I think, in our reporting of science, there's a great pressure to overplay things that are tentative, because science is tentative. And at the front edge, a lot of the stuff we're thinking is wrong, and that's what makes it interesting. But it's very hard to convey the fact that we're debating about exciting things, which are tentative and will evolve, but rather to be presented as great discoveries rather than great little steps.
I mean, I think there is a tendency in science journalism to publicize the latest single finding, ignoring the fact that has been shown often by statisticians that the majority of published findings are false.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, that doesn't mean the scientific enterprise is worthless, because all unsupported conjectures are false, as opposed to only a slight majority of scientific findings. And of course, you accumulate scientific findings so that after there are a large number of studies and meta-analyses and literature reviews are done, the overall picture of the truth can emerge. But focusing on a single study can be as misleading as focusing on a single anecdote. And really, there can't be the problem with any kind of criticism of science for having promoted findings which we later discover to be false is that it's only the standards of science that show that the earlier science was false. And in a sense, science as a method, as opposed to science as an institution, the particular people who happen to be running the scientific enterprise at any one time, but the standards of science, in a sense, you can't argue against them, because the only way that you could show any of the limitations of the claims to knowledge from science are with better science. It's like criticizing rationality. There's something inherently incoherent about it, because it's only by developing a more sophisticated rationality that you could criticize the rationality that's in effect at a given time.
I think Brian was frank the other day in a panel when he said that what you're actually trying to do, and I know this was loose, is to try to accumulate evidence to distinguish this just so story from that just so story, which acknowledges that science begins, as we all have always talked about, as storytelling. You have to tell some sort of a story to begin with, and then you test it against reality. But
That's right, but the one thing that I would emphasize is if we were better at communicating the larger framework within which science happens, which is it's almost unheard of for a new result to overthrow the past, simply wipe it out, and we're on to something that completely erases everything that came before. Usually, almost always, it's incremental shifts in our understanding. We understand a domain a little bit better, we can extend our ideas a little bit further. And indeed, at the cutting edge, those extensions often will later be shown to be wrong or need to be modified, but the core of the enterprise almost never is thrown away, is never wiped out. And that's the bit that gets lost when we always think, oh, new result says this, new result says that, and we feel that everything is changing. No, the core is not changing, it's just at the edge.
And I'd say, I'd get rid of the word almost. I mean, the great thing about science, and it's the biggest misunderstanding of science, is that scientific revolutions do away with everything that went before. That which has satisfied the test of experiment is not false once you discover new things. And that's a huge public misunderstanding. But I want to jump on something you said that I think is really worrisome, and that is stories. The public has this perception that science is a set of stories, and religion is a set of stories, and it's these stories versus these stories. But science is a lot more than stories. If it were just stories, it wouldn't be worth talking about. It's stories that make predictions. And it's a view that makes predictions about things that can be then tested. And that's the whole point. And I really do think that a lot of the public's perception or an unwillingness to sort of accept things is the perception that it's just a set of stories and that you can choose which ones you like best.
no, I'd already contexted that with Popper's discussion.
No, I know, I
but
wasn't
it's
obviously-
fine for you to make the point more strongly.
I think there's a problem also with trotting out Popper all the time because
Oh, okay.
there's a real sense in which there's a double standard whereby science is held to the sort of standards of Popper. You never actually prove anything, you only fail to disprove it. I mean, technically that applies to everything. That applies to the fact that this table is sitting here and that it's sunny outside.
Right.
I mean, these are just hypotheses that have never been falsified. But only science has to suffer this heckle of the Popperian standard. And the public misunderstands this. You know, evolution is only a theory. Well, yes, but it's only a theory that we're sitting on chairs. In that sense, in the same sense as it's a fact that we're sitting on chairs, it's also a fact that evolution is true.
Because one wants to add to the idea of science as an accumulating, self-adjusting body of knowledge, which it is, and which a million times a day, you know, every time you get in an airplane or use your mobile phone or something, via its applications through technology, is being constantly confirmed. I mean, it's getting a lot of supporting data there. But in addition to that, in describing what it is, one wants to say something about it as an attitude. That science is a way of doing things, a way of thinking and of finding out and of testing it. There's a very marked contrast between the scientific mindset, which is prepared not to know things yet, prepared not to understand things yet, prepared to be open-minded, prepared to recognize that solving a problem may very well generate a number of new problems, and to be interested and excited by that, to be interested and excited by uncertainty and open-endedness. Whereas there's another kind of mindset which wants a neat story with a beginning, a middle, and an end, wants closure, wants everything explained. This is characteristic of the religious mindset. And it's very uncomfortable with open-endedness and uncertainty, and not wanting to know. And there's a huge contrast between the fact that you can tell a closed, neat story which has got a beginning, middle, and end and a meaning in 10 minutes, and you can't do that with science. It takes a certain apprenticeship to be able to get in there and to be a net contributor to the scientific process. That's not the same thing as saying that it's hard to become scientifically literate, because this is the point we were talking about earlier, that we want to encourage people to be scientifically literate. But to understand that this open-endedness, this uncertainty, the fact that not all the answers are in, that some answers create more questions, all that kind of thing, is an excuse which is used by the people who like the neat closure type story to say, well, you don't know the answers, and there is uncertainty, we don't know how it began, we don't know where it's going, and to use that as an excuse for stopping thinking about it.
To come back to what Brian said, I think that meshes really nicely to his initial statement that the problem is somehow what we teach. It's a lot. That's a really difficult thing to teach, and it's a lot easier to teach a set of things you can test. And moreover, I think in addition to what you said, the problem is that the people who are doing the teaching are not necessarily comfortable with the science. And if you're not comfortable, if you haven't participated in the process and are not comfortable with it, it's very difficult to talk about it. And a great majority of the middle school science teachers in this country really have never taken, there's statistics, have never taken science beyond high school. I think therefore we have a real problem, because we get people to teach these set of facts and not the process, which is probably the most useful thing that kids can come out of school with. And so it's really a problem.
Well, I agree with you. I agree with those points. But there is still, the reason I made them is that there is this, in my experience anyway, this public perception of a need for certitude.
Yes, I think that's right.
The same thing with this recent stock market crisis. I mean, decisions made under conditions of uncertainty, the neuroscience of all of that. If the people had understood more of the neuroeconomics of all of this sort of stuff, perhaps it wouldn't have gone in this direction. I have no idea. But let me go back to a point that I think Brian made earlier, which is or maybe it was Richard, the fact that there's no overnight revolutions. What was it, 14 April 1953, the Crick and Watson paper was published on the DNA, the structure of DNA. There were virtually no citations of that paper, no increase in the number of citations, apart from the fact that it wasn't refereed, remember, because the enterprise of science at that point did not even have referees for journals, so it just got in because the editor thought it was a good paper.
Especially Nature. You know how the editor of Nature worked then?
It was John Maddox, was it?
No, but before John Maddox.
Yeah.
He took a briefcase full of papers to the Athenaeum Club in London, where all the members were sitting back in their armchairs after lunch snoozing, handing out papers. And then he would come back at tea time and pick them all up again, they having been refereed. That was
Okay, so things have changed slightly.
I think.
So there are 2 points. There are 2 points in here. One point is that the DNA paper, the classic paper, itself did not start being cited in large numbers until roughly 1990, when the Human Genome Project got into gear. In other words, when the technologization of it all started happening.
Well, that's not so surprising.
Yeah,
we talked about it. I mean, great, really important advances aren't obvious at the time, all the time. I mean, we had.
There's a spike.
But we had, at this meeting, Steve Weinberg here, won the Nobel Prize for the Standard Model, and his paper wasn't cited at all. For years afterwards,
yeah.
and I think it happens in every one of our
well,
fields.
The Darwin-Wallace paper was completely ignored in 1858.
Yes, is part of it also that science doesn't work from canonical texts, and the actual paper is not that big a deal compared to the idea, that once an idea becomes so obviously true that it becomes second nature, you don't need to cite the original source. If I cite if I mention the inverse square law, I don't need to have a footnote attributing it to.
Yeah, exactly. Once it's important, it's
and I think with Watson and Crick, I mean, I don't know how many people felt the need to cite that paper once it just became the indispensable infrastructure of biology.
I think the point was that it still took a while, as with the reading at the Linnean Society of the Darwin and Wallace papers, for it even to penetrate what was going on.
I think it can happen both ways. I mean, there's certainly, I'm aware of papers that really changed people's thinking fairly significantly in terms of what they were going to work on. That paper came out, and they just changed their research and focused upon it. Again, it didn't wipe out the core of the science that went before. It just had enough of a compelling story to tell. Absolutely, you don't like that word.
No,
It had enough of a new direction that people said, this is something I really want to work on. They'd shift immediately. And yes, as you say, there are other examples where technology needs to catch up before you can really make use of it.
And
but I think the bottom line is the core is stable.
Yeah, absolutely. And, but we, all of us have been. We all probably have to write research grants and proposals, and it always amazes me because you're supposed to be talking about what you're going to be doing 4 years down the road. And if science is any good, you don't know what you're going to be doing 4 years down the road.
Let me play devil's advocate for a minute and take that point beyond where it was going. The second point that came out of that was, I've spoken to a number of scientists who would actually say, if they had to write a headline, science is broken. And what they meant by that is that there's too many people trying to get too many papers into too few journals. The refereeing process is very difficult. It's not people sitting at the Athenaeum passing the thing around. And somehow there needs to be a different kind of refereeing system for people to judge their work, that maybe there shouldn't be anonymous referees, maybe people should have to sign their referee. Do you have a sense of any of this? Because that's another part of the community, how the community is arranged.
No, I think it's a cogent point in that we scientists probably have not applied scientific self-scrutiny to our own cultural norms as much as we should. It's been taken for granted that peer review is the only ritual that can sanctify a finding, even though we know from studies of peer review that it has a number of systematic flaws. The name, the reputation of the person writing the paper makes too big a difference, which you can always guess even when it's blacked out. Too much depends arbitrarily on the choice of referees. If you just pick 2 people, that is such a small sample that the outcome is going to be determined by whether you have someone that's sympathetic or not to the basic approach. And there are alternatives. I think we've inherited a practice that comes from the era in which paper was a limiting resource, that mailing out copies of a journal was so expensive that only a small number of organizations could do it. Now that we do have the internet and as a form of disseminating information, and space is basically limitless, we should look to other models of quality control. And like PLOS, the Public Library of Science, which has some different techniques, such as people can post comments on published papers, and so if a bad paper gets published, it will live with the ignominy of all of the critical remarks.
Yeah, I'm not, I've been in that position recently, as in one of the positions I have in the American Physical Society, which published this unpeer-reviewed journal, and there was a global warming skeptics paper that got into it, and then it was interpreted immediately as a scientific finding. I tend to think, I'm not sure, there is an editor friend of mine who would like to publish every paper he gets along with the referee's report beside it. And that's one possibility. It would make better referees reports, I think that's for sure. But I think peer review is like democracy. It's got a lot of problems, but right now I think it works on average, and I don't know if there's a better system, because the problem with the internet is there's no filter. At some level, if you want to, there's so much information out there and so little time to read. We already get too many papers that we can read. We have to, I think, as a community, have some filter that allows us to select out.
Let me make a radical suggestion that maybe we should evaluate the different methods empirically. As scientists, see which one.
That's not a bad idea.
But along those lines, Lawrence, do you actually read peer-reviewed articles?
No, Brian's exactly right. In our field, by the time it gets peer-reviewed, it's old news.
Yeah, so we basically, everything goes on our online archive, and we just choose what we want to read.
And we decide what's garbage on our own, as opposed to reading it in the journal and saying it's garbage.
More or less. But there is a difficulty with that, though. That is that, so some people are competent to differentiate between stuff that's rubbish and stuff that isn't. And then there are a lot of people out there who aren't really competent to make that. And this is why, providing one's careful about this, that there is some utility in a bottleneck system, which serves, to some extent at any rate, as an expert filter for what comes through. You could have a situation where let anybody publish what they like on the internet. In fact, they can already. If you've written a paper and you want to publish it on your blog site or something, you can go ahead and do it. So there's no reason why absolutely anything that gets written shouldn't be out there. But what you do want is to have some sort of imprimatur. You want some sort of recognition that peers, that colleagues are prepared to take this seriously and discuss it and so on. After all, peer review and publication in the traditional way is anyway only one step in the life of an idea or a paper. And there are going to be lots of other things that are tested too. When people try and replicate those results or something, they may well find out that in fact the stuff doesn't work, and that's going to be a check on it. So I think there is something to be said for obliging things if they're going to have a little bit of a stamp of acceptability on it from the profession, that there should be a bit of a bottleneck, providing that it doesn't result in a lot of good stuff and very innovative stuff just being excluded, as could well happen with something which is really genuinely original.
Well, it's more archival in a sense. We don't. There's not every piece of paper in this room that we're going to keep for posterity, and we tend. I think peer review in journals, in some sense, have now become archival. It's more a record of those things which seem to represent progress in the field, as opposed to the things which really drive progress right now, which are probably before, at least in physics, before peer review.
But there's an interesting point here, which one of the writers for Science, the magazine, John Cohen, made at a meeting the other day, which was he was saying that the way most undergraduates, and maybe graduates as well, and postdocs, get their information is to go online to PubMed and put in their institution's subscription, download the PDF of the specific paper, and they're done. Well, half of the book of a journal like Nature or Science, the front half of the book is not papers, it's context. It's what is the science community doing and what's the world doing about science. It's got all the news stories in there, the context, the commentary, and so on. And very few of them actually physically touch these things anymore. Now, is that a loss? I mean, context is...
Well, so if it's correct context, I mean, I think, although, you know, I'm not sure I agree, because at least most of us probably get a lot of our stuff electronically now anyway. And as far as science and nature is concerned, I tend to get their weekly news. I mean, I get on my email all the context and commentary that would have come in the front half.
You'd be
of that by
surprised
email.
if even if you talk about an ordinary newspaper, how many people you'll go to when they're reading the online version will suddenly, because they're staying at a hotel or something, get a newspaper and they'll say, I found such really interesting stories here that I'd never have seen before because it was online.
Yeah,
There's an amazing service that will actually download and print stories on hard copy and deliver it to you in your mailbox. It's called magazines.
revolutionary.
No, but you know what? We're all of a pretty well a similar generation, I think. And I'm wondering, it'll be an interesting empirical study. I'm wondering if my daughter's generation or her children's generation, when there's one, will in fact find it much more comfortable to read things online. For example, I bet all of us made this transition. When I first started to write scientific papers, at the beginning, it was very difficult for me to do things on computers. But now I can't handwrite anything. And that transition has been made. And it could just be that we're just dinosaurs ourselves and we're relics of this paper generation. And it's not easy for us to get information that way, and that the next generation will find it much more comfortable to do that. I don't know.
I think Anthony's objection to the putting it on your blog and I mean the need for a filter is met if other people recommend it. I mean, I often get emails from them saying, you must read this paper, it's terrific. And if that's from somebody I respect, then I'll go and read it. And so you could sort of have a network of not formal refereeing, but of informal recommendation, and anybody can read. I mean, if Lawrence has a blog, then I can read that he recommends this paper. I would do it.
Well, we have an imperfect system in physics where not everybody can post to the physics archive. I forget what the requirements are, but you have to reach a certain threshold before you're allowed to freely post articles. Now, that's not always a good thing. I've gotten many phone calls from people, will you please be my sponsor so I can post this paper? And it maybe is, I don't have time to read, I get too, but on the one hand, you don't want to cut out the people because they don't reach the threshold. On the other hand, it does do what you're saying. It's not quite refereeing, but people have a certain level of experience and already a track record.
The other thing, sorry, go ahead.
Sure, go ahead.
The other thing is that publishing on paper has become so easy now. I get Vanity Press books essentially every day.
Yeah, all of us do.
And I sort of look and see I don't recognize that publisher's name. And then you realize that it's from the same small town as the author.
But I also want to exactly. But I want to jump in. I don't know what it's like in biology, but I think we already operate under your principle. I bet Brian and I do not look at every paper that's on the archive every day, or even the abstracts of every paper. We tend to end up looking at those that are, the good papers word of mouth tends to filter, and our students tell us, or whatever, and there's just so much that we already rely on that filtering process before we choose stuff.
That's absolutely right.
I mean, we have models from elsewhere in cyberspace. I mean, imagine if the way that a search engine works is every time you have a website, 2 people get picked to peer review the website, and then what comes on top on your internet search would be the one that's refereed by 2 people, as opposed to, say, Google page rankings, which is entirely implicit, based on hundreds of thousands of choices of who links to whom, which is a kind of collective vote as to which websites
Have you talked
matter.
That's a great idea. You could become a billionaire, I think. If you
I mean, and in a sense, I think we don't know what the best model is going to be for scientific review. There's got to be some sort of quality control. Whether the current system of 2 to 3 referees picked by a human being and having veto power over paper is the best system, I tend to doubt.
But don't you think that's what's good about science? It doesn't depend on the human peer reviewing. What eventually succeeds is what works.
Yes.
People pick up that's what's good about science. What works survives. The garbage doesn't anyway, and people pick up on it because it works and allows them to go further. And so it's just the scientific process that moves beyond that sort of human frailty.
It's a self-healing process, which
Yeah.
is why single fraudulent reports don't corrupt the entire enterprise.
For a while they can.
For a little while they can, but the enterprise works around them.
But are there any good examples of an absolutely excellent paper that was suppressed in the modern era, and it took a while before it bubbled up?
Oh, sure.
Yes.
Yeah, there's the ones about, there's a whole, I think
In
more.
physics, I'm referring to.
In physics.
Well, in biochemistry, my friend
Yeah,
John
but those are,
Krebs
in
has-
other words, the nice thing about physics is you can sit down with a piece of paper and generally calculate. Again, if it's an experimental result, it's harder. But a theoretical, are there any
No, the
wonderful
ones I think
theoretical
it's more
papers?
being ignored rather than suppressed.
Right,
I mean,
okay,
they're just people
yeah.
didn't realize the importance. But
Right.
I don't know, but I think Richard's right. There are suppressions, and I think, but one of the reasons maybe because of, I tend to think maybe because of money, that biochemical things. I mean, there's a lot more money in medicine and pharmaceuticals that unfortunately adds a whole different set of pressures that we don't really have in physics at this point.
There was a list was going around. This is a slightly cheesy question. You'll forgive me in advance, but there was a question on the Freakonomics column of the New York Times recently that said, you get these top 10 lists of who's the best, who named the top 10 people you know, and we never get a who are the top 10 scientists list, right? It's okay. So in fact, if you go and take a look at it, it's mostly the people at this table, as it happens, but asking you the same sort of thing over the past 350 years, not who was don't give me the list of Newton and Darwin. Can you think of some unsung heroes that people really should go and figure out what they were doing? And
Well, I think that's the wrong question.
All right, okay.
People are too fixated on people. And I mean, it's great. I mean, it's nice to have scientific role models, and I think it's good for kids to have scientific role models. But the people are, I mean, there may have been amazing people,
Well,
and in a historical context, it's wonderful. But they're irrelevant to the science.
yeah, well, let me tell you, the practice of science and science as a method is one thing, and I agree with you about that. But I find that practically, if you tell people Bill Hamilton's life story and what he discovered, but put it in the context of who Bill Hamilton was, it somehow comes alive in a different
Oh, sure.
kind
To
of
get
way.
people interested, it's true. But
Richard,
there's a whole,
do
but
you see what I'm getting at
Yeah,
there?
kind of.
there's a whole realm of journalism I call People Magazine sort of science reporting, which is
That's not what I'm
always
talking about.
Everyone, and I agree with you. We need to humanize the endeavor. People have to realize that scientists are human, and that's why there's a lot of efforts. In fact, and I think both Brian and I are in this, and maybe a bunch of the others here, trying to get scientific themes in Hollywood, and so scientists on. It's more integrated into the culture, so people realize that scientists are people and the scientific endeavor is culturally interesting, etc. I agree with you completely there to humanize it, and so that's important.
And that's difficult in itself. You have a series like Lie to Me on Fox TV now, which is based on the Paul Ekman's work, of course, the facial expressions and so on and so forth. So it's hard to convey some of the science in those sorts of things. But I still liked my question.
According to one poll, the people were asked to name famous scientist, and the one who came out on top was Bill Gates, and the second one was Al Gore. So we have some work to do.
There's some work to do. Last question then. Over that period of the operation of this enterprise, the Merchants of Light, going forward, what's the most exciting thing in each of your fields that you are looking forward to?
Well, I'll just.
That's another People Magazine question.
Yes, well,
but
anyway,
answer
for
it.
the simple
Answer
answer,
it.
when someone asks me what's the next great thing, I always
I
say if I
didn't
knew,
say
I'd
what's
be
the
doing
next
it.
great thing.
But I think there are.
And Einstein said if it wasn't called research,
well, I don't want
yeah.
to usurp. I bet Brian and I agree on almost, and that's what's great. And you can add to this, but there, in cosmology, it's it's this nature of this weird energy that dominates empty space. In particle physics, I think it's the domain that Brian has written about a lot, which is the way to try and unify the forces of nature and understand quantum mechanics and gravity, and those are the frontiers. But where the next great discovery will be, maybe somewhere else. I don't know if they're.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is, in my wildest dreams, what I'd hope to happen before I leave this Earth or universe is maybe we'll understand what are the basic constituents of space and time. I mean, there's a lot of evidence that space and time are derivative, emergent ideas, but we don't really know what the fundamental constituents of them would be. And we've got hints of it, and maybe that's something we'll make progress on.
I think for my field, the sciences of mind, the most exciting development is the melting of boundaries between psychology and other sciences, and other fields of endeavor, in fact. The birth of neuroeconomics, of behavioral economics, of evolutionary psychology, of the psychology of aesthetics, of moral psychology applied to jurisprudence and moral philosophy, the elimination of these 19th century disciplinary boundaries that I think stood in the way of a coherent understanding.
I know I'm going to jump in. That's another advertisement. That was the thing we were trying to achieve at this meeting, and that's the thing we're going to continue to try and achieve. But I should also say as well that Brian and I, our bias, we're talking about particle physics, is probably a related aspect of that, that is probably also extremely exciting, which is the disappearance of the boundaries between physics and biology, which I think will be another huge threshold area.
Well, I think I would have to say understanding consciousness, which is more Steve's field than mine. So I won't say that because it's not my field. I think I would say perhaps a complete computer simulation of an origin of artificial life and subsequent evolution in an artificial world with its own physics and its own ecology, its own ecosystem, a second life that actually evolves rather than being designed by humans.
Well, the most exciting thing in my field is science, because I'm not a scientist. I'm a philosopher and a spectator and an amateur of science, and it is thrilling. I mean, beyond description, really, to see what's happening. I mean, across all these fields, cosmology in fundamental particle physics, in biology and biomedical sciences, the progress that's being made now is really extraordinary. And because I have an interest in philosophy and philosophy of mind as well, what's happening in neuroscience and its effect on understanding psychology and on consciousness. But what all this does, in a way, is to show that Lawrence's point is absolutely right, that the sciences are bleeding into one another, that the boundaries are coming down, that what's in effect happening is that we're having a sort of a new second wind of the Enlightenment. I talked earlier about the way that ideas and methods in the natural sciences have been applied more broadly, social sciences and humanities in the Enlightenment, to alter our conceptions of society and human nature and human flourishing. And with this breach in the walls of the different disciplines, because there's been too much over-specialism. We all know that since the 19th century, since the German attitude to how you conduct research really became the dominant paradigm. And now that all these walls are being breached, and we are seeing tremendous amount of cross-fertilization, and as a result, huge new insights. So, to be a spectator of this process is to be enthralled by it.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. Richard, A.C. Grayling, Lawrence, Steve Pinker, Brian Greene. I'll see you back here in 2360.
I hope so.
For the 700th anniversary of the Society.
Thanks.
Great. Thanks a lot.